Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, and I'm super excited to be here with Travis Ireland. Oh my God, Travis Ireland, who's going to be talking to us about Irish whiskeys. He is a podcaster from the Friskey Whiskey Podcast. And so I just think he's going to be the perfect person to tell us all about the history of Irish whiskey and some interesting tastings that we're going to be doing. So if you have a highballer, just bring it in and we'll enjoy it while we're talking. Before we get started, though, I just want to say a couple things. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. And I'd like to thank Travis for letting us share this program with other libraries, because when libraries work together, we make magic. And tonight, maybe we might be like falling down drunk. Who knows? But we had 45 libraries join this program, because I think that it's just going to be really, we're all interested. We all really know what it's all about. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is the button at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen. If you want to chat with each other, I'm going to leave the chat open even through Travis's slides, so you can chat with each other, talk about places you've been and things you've tried. And but I will hold questions until midway through Travis's slides, so you can hear the history, and then we can start talking about recommendations. So Travis, like I said, Ireland, is the co-host of the Friskey Whiskey Podcast, but he's an IT person by day, a whiskey aficionado by night. I'm going to hand it over to you, Travis, to tell us more about yourself, your podcast, and all of the whiskeys we're going to be talking about. Thank you so much for doing this with us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mina. That's quite the introduction. So my name is Travis Ireland. I am a co-host of the Friskey Whiskey Podcast. We started back in February of 2022. Me and my best friend Mike. We just had a passion for whiskeys over the years and decided to turn our drinking into a hobby. So, um, so please, check us out whenever you get a chance. I'm going to present.
I'm going to put a link to the podcast in a recap email to everybody. So just pay
Perfect.
attention to that after the show.
Yeah. And actually, that QR code, if you want, that actually goes to our friskywhiskey.com. Alrighty. So let's start off. So Irish whiskey has quite the time. It goes back to, I'm going to say, probably before the 12th century. But it's noted that in the 12th century is really where distillation came into play. So back then, more than likely, it was the Moors, which is a Muslim group, was creating alcohol for the purpose of medicinal, right, to heal wounds and all that stuff. But once the Moors were driven out by the Catholic armies, um, the distillation process was handed over to the monks in Ireland. And of course, they decided to do what every good whiskey lover would do in that situation and create some whiskey. It was initially known and called Use Betha, which I'm sure I'm butchering that, which means the water of life in Gaelic. It also has other terms like aqua vitae. So in 1405, this was the first time that there's a written record of whiskey in Irish literature in the Annals of Clon MacNoise, right, which mentions the death of a chieftain taking a surfeit of aqua vitae at Christmas. If we go on down the line to 1494, this is actually the earliest indication of the distilled spirit made from cereal that's mentioned in Scotland, also referring to it as aqua vitae when the king at the time sent a letter to Friar John Core requesting him to make some. Based on that, it was determined that the making of or distilling of whiskey had gone from Ireland over to Scotland as well. So there was an act passed by the English Parliament back in 1556, making aqua vitae illegal to produce without a license. So this is where we kind of get the Parliament digging in and wanting basically their taxes. So there was exceptions only for peers to the Lord Deputy, gentlemen, and the freemen of larger towns of Ireland. Beyond the Pale, which is the areas not of Ireland that weren't controlled by the British at the time, uh, this whole act really didn't have much of an impact. So there's a lot of underground distilleries and stuff like that going on at this time. Then in 1608, the first licensed distillery, the Old Bushmills Distillery in County Antrim, is licensed by King James I. Of course, this making it, according to the claims, the world's oldest licensed distillery. The Bushmills Distillery, as it is known today, was officially registered and began operations in 1784. The date of 1608 is significant because it marks the early recognition of distilling practices in the region of Bushmills, Northern Ireland, but it does not mean the distillery in its current form has been in operation since then. All right, now we're heading off, getting towards the end of the 17th century. So on December 24th, 1661, the king put a tax on whiskey in Ireland and that was the beginning of what we now know as customs and excise. So you can thank the king for that one. So it was to curb the illegal distilling in Ireland. Irish whiskey became split into Parliament whiskey, or the legally made and produced whiskey, and the legal Poitin. Distillers didn't have to register, and the law was full of loopholes, meaning illegal distillations was all over the place. We had similar issues here in the United States, probably around similar time. So the Kilbeggan distillery is opened by Matthew McManus, and Peter Rowe also starts his distillery in Dublin. The Kilbeggan distillery is recognized as one of the oldest licensed distilleries in Ireland and was founded in 1757. Peter Rowe would also purchase a small distillery on the north side of Thomas Street in Dublin 2 years before Arthur Guinness would sign that famous 9,000-year lease for the St. James Gate Brewery. In 1759, the English Parliament passes an act to prohibit distillers from using any ingredient except malt, grain, potatoes, and sugar. This was in response to the unregulated industry, which was leading to wild disparities in quality of whiskey. In 1761, registration to produce whiskey stops being voluntary and requires the payment of tax. So again, in retaliation to this, the distillers went underground so they could make their whiskey, or their Poitin. That's Poitin, I believe. So in 1779, Lord North, who was a lord in London, he revises the excise system from taxing the volume of spirits to the distillation equipment itself. So legal distilleries in Ireland at the time was just over 1,200, and that dropped down to 246 within a year. So that had a massive impact, because you can imagine the volume you could hide, but you can't really hide your distillation equipment too well. Operations continued to go underground. The remaining lawful distilleries, however, struggled with this tax. They expedited the distillation process by increasing the heat so they could make more distillate, which caused issues with frothing. So they would actually add soap to combat the frothing that would occur with this increased heat. But that obviously it adversely impacts the quality of the whiskey, but also the taste of the whiskey. And that ended up earning the name gut rot. So fines and taxation further burdened the poorest communities, while legal distillers produced higher quality Poyton. So it's kind of funny how the taxes ended up switching from that Parliament whiskey we spoke about earlier, and that illegal swill, if you will, became the actual quality whiskey. All right. So in 1782, the first Teeling distillery was opened by Walter Teeling on Marrowbone Lane. And then they introduced the malt tax. So many distilleries paid duty on malt as well as spirit. In response, whiskey makers favor mash bills that contained unmalted barley, a forerunner to the Irish style of whiskey called single pot still. See, taxes are driving all the innovation. 1822 to 23 was a very busy year for Irish whiskeys. So, an excise officer in Donegal records at least 800 illegal stills on the Iashowen Peninsula alone. His name was Anus Coffey. The number of registered distilleries is 40, which halved by the next year. In 1823, the 1823 Excise Act meant distillers would only pay duty on what they create, so licensed distilleries go up. By 1835, there's now 93 distilleries. Also, at this point, the largest pot still in Ireland has a capacity of 750 gallons. So we can see now that they've kind of restricted, or they've dropped it off. The tax has gone from being on the distilling equipment itself and back over to the distillate. We can see that they're able to produce more without sacrificing the quality of that whiskey. So in 1825, on December 20th, Lord Middleton sold his property to brothers James Daniel and Jeremiah Murphy. That's the same Murphy family as the Irish Stout, for £4,000. They converted it into a distillery. They then installed a massive 31,618 gallon pot still, which remains the largest pot still and was built so large that the distillery was actually built around it. And I actually, grabbed a picture of that so everyone could check that out. I thought that was crazy. That thing looks like if you put it up against that building, it'd probably go up to the third window, which is huge. So in 1831, so that excise officer from Donegal that I mentioned earlier from 1822, Anus Coffey, patents the coffee still after inventing a continuous still. So that's a method that allows distillers to produce a greater volume of whiskey more efficiently and at a lower cost. The response in Ireland is mixed. Within a decade, there's 13 stills in operation in Ireland compared to 2 in Scotland. But the big four, John Jameson, William Jameson, John Power, and George Rowe, are all still saying that its quality is inferior to that of a pure pot still whiskey. At that point, Coffey leaves for Scotland and England, where his still is welcome. And you could kind of see that coming, right? So in 1822, he kind of changed up how the taxes were working on it, and then he comes out with a still that can continuously still distill it without needing to slow down. Smart move. The 1830s to 40s. So this was the temperance movement and the potato famine, unfortunately. So the temperance movement is something that will actually hit the United States about 90 years later. So it was around 1834 that there was a temperance movement within Ireland. That is the moderation or abstinence completely from alcohol. That is swiftly followed by the potato blight and the devastation of the Great Famine of the 1840s. Unfortunately, over 1 million people had died and 2.1 million people leave the country. Among that devastation is the reduction of the domestic market for Irish whiskey, but that doesn't really seem that important. So, also in the 1830s, we had the introduction of the railway. They were just starting to build it, but in the 1860s, they've officially opened up a national railway. So that allowed transporting goods from far south as Cork all the way up to Bushmills in the north. Then in 1863, phylloxera, which that's an aphid-like insect that's native here in North America, is identified in Europe. This hits France pretty heavy within a few decades. Just about half of all of their vineyards are destroyed, which is about 2.5 million hectares at the time. And that completely devastates the wine and brandy industries. This allows Irish whiskey to kind of take that jump up and become more popular around the world. In 1867, James Murphy, he was at the time the head of Middleton Distillery. He pitches an idea of amalgamating the operations of several local distilleries. And in 1867, the Cork Distilleries Company, or CDC, is formed from four Cork distilleries. That would be North Mall, The Green, Watercourse, and Daly's. And then a year later, in 1868, the Middleton Distillery joins that group. In 1878, the coffee stills are still having a hard time gaining popularity within Ireland. The big Dublin distillers are publishing pamphlets entitled The Truths About Whiskey, decrying the output of coffee stills as not fit to be whiskey, good, bad, or indifferent, but it cannot be whiskey, and it ought not to be sold under that name. To be fair, I think we have similar feelings here about American whiskeys. They had been using the pot stills for almost 700 years at this point. If you remember the 12th century, they had discovered this and they started using pot stills back then. So 700 years of distilling and having a process like that, I could imagine being a little bit shy about moving to a different process. So in 1887, author Alfred Bernard publishes his famous book, uh, The Whiskey Distilleries of the United Kingdom. So that notes that there are 28 distilleries still in operation in Ireland. Now, I don't know if I tried to look into this a little bit more. I tried to see if it was a limited travel or something like that, but it didn't really state in the book. Some of the notable mentions within the book are Bow Street, Tullamore, Limerick, Middletown, or the Middleton, Marrowbone, Bushmills, and Limavady. So those were some of the distilleries that he had mentioned in his book of the 28. In 1909, a royal commission is established to investigate and report on the use of coffee stills, which are used to create 60% of all whiskey produced in Britain and Ireland. Traditionalists are arguing that only spirits produced in pot stills should be considered true whiskey, but the commission declares that whiskey could refer to the output of either coffee or pot stills. And in 1918, we have the First World War, a Spanish influenza breakout, and a coal shortage, all of which have a massive impact on the Irish whiskey industry. And of course, about 100 years later, from the temperance movement that they had in Ireland, they now have the Irish Civil War of Independence and the subsequent prohibition here in the United States. So the Civil War further disrupted whiskey production and export within Ireland. And then, of course, the prohibition here in the United States was established in 1920, going to 1933. Irish whiskey had accounted for more than 60% of the whiskey sales here in the US in the 1800s. So it was a massive hit to the market. Protectionist policies introduced by the Irish Free State government, which significantly cap whiskey exports in the hope of taxing domestic consumption, play a part, as does the widespread counterfeiting of Irish whiskeys in America and Britain. Combine that with overexpansion and mismanagement at several Irish distilleries, and the Irish whiskey industry is in a terminal decline. In the early 20th century, Scotland surpassed Ireland to become the world's largest whiskey producer. All right, in 1966, there's just a few distilleries hanging on at this point. So John Jameson Powers and the Cork Distilleries Company decide to, again, create another amalgamation of their operations under the name of Irish Distillers. They close existing facilities and concentrate all of their operations in a new purpose-built facility to be constructed beside the old Middleton Distillery in County Cork. That distillery today is home to many Irish whiskies such as Jameson, Powers, Paddy, Redbreast, Middleton Very Rare, Method and Madness, and the Spot range, of which I'll be having 2 of. All right, so then we have the 1970s. I kind of combined all these together because the timelines became kind of tight, and there's a few things happening throughout each of these decades. So Jameson Irish whiskey is actually changed from a single pot still to a more accessible and affordable blend. That technically happened in 1968, but I put it into the 1970s. I was like, it's close enough. On the 5th of June, 1970, the last drops of pot still whiskey were distilled at the Jameson Distillery in Bow Street, ending nearly 200 years of whiskey production in Dublin. In 1972, the only other remaining Irish operation, Bushmills, joins the Irish Distillers. That was created in 1966. Now there are 2 distillers producing whiskey in Ireland, and they are both owned by the same company. Someone say monopoly. So we get into the 1980s, and in 84, the first Middleton Very Rare is launched. A reminder that great new Irish whiskey can still be made. In 87, years of monopoly is smashed when Cooley Distillery is opened by John Teeling. The new distillery acquires the assets of the Kilbeggan Distillery, allowing Cooley to relaunch whiskeys under the Kilbeggan and Locks whiskey brands. In 1988, Pernod Ricard takes over Irish Distillers, bringing increased funding and marketing into Irish whiskey. That actually prompted the Irish whiskey become the fastest growing spirit in the world once again. In the 1990s, so in December of 91, Redbreast was relaunched by Irish Distillers after nearly a decade of absence. Whiskey writer Michael Jackson, not to be confused with the musical artist, described it as a traditional Irish pot still at its richest and says that for some lovers of the style, Redbreast approaches perfection. The old Jameson Distillery on Bow Street was reopened as a visitor center in 1997. They had more history throughout, where in 2007 they did major renovations, and an additional $12.6 million of renovations was done in March of 2016. In June of 2005, the Bushmills Distillery was bought by Diageo for £200 million. And then we're kind of getting to the 2010s. The Kilbeggan Distillery, closed since 1954, reopened fully. In 2012, Beam Inc., now Beam Suntory, buys the Cooley Distillery that was opened back in 1987. In 2014, the Department of Agriculture creates a technical file for Irish whiskey, giving Irish whiskey a protected European geographical indication. In September of that year, the new Tullamore Distillery opened, returning production of Tullamore Dew to Tullamore after a break of 60 years. In November, Diageo traded the Bushmills brand with Proximo Spirits in exchange for 50% of the Don Julio brand of tequila that it did not already own. In 2015, Jack and Stephen Teeling opened Teeling Distillery, the first new distillery built in Dublin City for over 125 years. Great Northern Ireland's largest independent distillery is opened by John Teeling, founder of the Cooley Distillery. And then Louis McGuane founded J.J. Corey, the first new Irish whiskey bonder in over 50 years. Mark Rainier, formerly the co-owner of Bruichladdich, sorry, I butchered that one pretty bad, founded the Waterford Distillery with a focus on terrier-driven whiskey. So that right there is the history of Irish whiskey. Do we have any questions, Mina? I don't see the chat.
Nothing in particular yet, but people are anxiously waiting to hear your recommendations for Irish whiskeys.
Perfect. So there's a lot of history that covers a lot of time, and you're talking, what is that, 19? It's like 1,000 years almost of history. So it's a
Yeah,
long time.
I sort of feel like we should say there'll be a test after this, but that was a lot.
I should have created a test for this.
Well, I mean, it's so interesting that it's 1,000 years of history and that whiskey continued on despite the fact that people kept trying to like take it down or, tax the crap out of it or anything like
Yeah.
that. Oh, I do have a question. What does spirit mean in terms of whiskey?
Spirit in terms of whiskey. So if in my thoughts, it's actually the base spirit, the white dog, if you will. It's before it's aged out when you're actually making it. That to me is what the spirit is.
Oh, okay. And Claire asks, if I wanted to, could I actually make whiskey in my kitchen or is it too much equipment required?
No, you could. They make home distilling kits. It's not the process is a little bit tedious, and you might make really bad batches of whiskey to start, but give it a couple times. The making of the spirit itself is the easy part. That'll take you, a couple days, but it's the waiting 4 years to find out if it's good or not. That's the problem.
That is a problem. DM says we recently just had proper 12 brand and it was very smooth. And John says I am enjoying a Glendalough pot still. I didn't hear you mention that distillery.
No, actually, so through the history of things there in Ireland, there's a lot. They don't mention every single distillery and when it's open because there's a lot to be accounted for. As I said, at one point there was over 1,200 distilleries active that had been cut down to 40 and then grown back up to 93 and then cut back down with the temperance movement and then back up and then with war and famine and all that. So there's a chance that it could have been lost to history on when they actually officially opened and who decided to start that distillery, and that's kind of part of the fun of the history of whiskey.
Mhm. Marianne asks, have the allowable agreed ingredients changed since 1739?
So that's actually something on one of the slides I'll get to, but no, technically speaking, as long as it's a barley, potato, sugar, those are all things just, that are allowed to be used in whiskey production.
Hmm. And Claudia asks, do barrels contribute to the taste and color?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, actually, that is where the majority of flavor comes from and the color. And
Huh.
given the time and the char levels within the barrels themselves and the type of wood used, that all contributes to what the final product's going to be.
Hmm. So, an offshoot of that question is like for wines, I've heard that, the oak barrels versus other wood barrels versus metal barrels really makes a difference. Would you say that that's true for whiskey as well? I mean, do they even use metal barrels for whiskey?
No, to my knowledge, no one would ever use a metal barrel just because you wouldn't get any of the tannins out of the woods or anything like that. So you'd really be missing out on aging it. You would just be storing, the spirit itself in a metal container.
Hmm. Chang asked why is Middleton called very rare Irish whiskey?
That is a great question. I didn't look at that. That wasn't one I was expecting.
See, I told you we tried to stump you.
Perfect. I'll look it up though.
Okay, well, he's going to be Googling that during the next questions. But Bill said, I do have a few more questions, and then we're
Yeah.
going to go on to your tasting. Bill asked, what is a simple distinction between a single pot still and a coffee still?
Well, Bill,
Actually, Travis, do you want to
it's
go out?
great that
Okay, go
yeah.
ahead.
Oh, I was going to say because the next slide is literally talking about the stills.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then let me see. I just want to go back to make sure that we didn't get. So Irish whiskey has to age 4 years and Scottish is just for 3. Do you know why that makes a difference?
So actually, Irish whiskey is 3.
Oh,
Yeah. So Irish whiskey, the only requirement as far as aging goes is 3 years.
okay. Um, yeah. I see. Yeah.
Um,
Poteen. What is poteen?
Poitin.
Wait.
Poitin is that was the illegal mash that was
Mm,
used before when they had the Parliament whiskey, and then they had Poitin. Poitin was the illegal whiskey that was being made. Think of our moonshine
mhm.
here in the
Ah,
States.
I will. All right. So let's go on with some of your slides in the tasting, and then I'll get
Okay.
back to the other questions at once we do that.
Sure. So that was a good segue from Bill. Thank you. So the coffee still, it's actually a column still, as we learned in 1831, was Innis Coffee had invented this. So a coffee still, the intent of them is to be a continuous still, meaning that you can continuously distill, allowing for larger scale production without the downtime and cleaning. The feature itself is 2 columns with compartments, so you can kind of see uh, individual compartments here that allows the steam and the spirit vapor to pass upwards. As they go up, they cool down, so that means they condense back from a gas into a liquid, and that becomes the final spirit. Column stills or they claim, produce a pure, cleaner spirit with a higher concentration, up to 95% alcohol by volume. These are generally used for production of grain whiskeys and light rums. You can also produce gin and vodka in them. Now, a pot still, these are batch stills, meaning they still a very specific amount of liquid, which is the wash, in a single run. They require cleaning and refilling for the next batch. They consist of a single chamber or that pot right here. Not sure if you can see my mouse. Um, and where was I? Where the wash is heated and the resulting vapors are condensed up at the top to produce the spirit. The pot stills are known for producing full flavored spirits with a higher concentration of congeners or second alcohol compounds that contribute to the flavor. They are often used for producing spirits like tequila, some Jamaican rums, mezcal, and malt whiskeys. It is actually legally required that a single malt Scotch whiskey and cognac be produced in these types of stills. So in order for it to be considered a single malt Scotch, it has to be produced in a pot still, which I thought was pretty cool. All right, did that answer your questions, Bill?
I think it did. But the two questions that I have up
Mhm.
now are if there's any specific differences between Irish whiskeys and Scotch whiskeys.
Awesome. Actually, I was talking with Bina about this earlier.
Yes.
Uh, so I'm going to say that as long as you're both making them in the traditional sense that the way that they're supposed to be made, if you're using a single malt and all that stuff, I'm going to say absolutely not. Um, the regions in which they are being produced, they're relatively similar as far as weather goes, year in and year out. I will say that Scotch whiskey, they have the benefit of peat, the peat moss that they can use in their process, which obviously adds a large amount of smoky flavor and as well as other nuances to Scotch. But if you took a unpeated Scotch and an Irish whiskey of the same age, made with the same, grain or malt, I honestly think you would probably have a very similar product. Not saying that they would taste the same, but that you'd have a similar quality of product.
Mhm. I think your next slides, as I recall, are about the three scotches that you wanted to try. Oh
Well,
no.
actually, yeah, my next one is actually talking about the different styles of Irish whiskey. Then I'm getting into, are we
Okay.
pushing? Yeah.
Then I'll have a comment then.
Perfect. So I'll go into the different types of Irish whiskey. So we have a blended Irish whiskey, which are blends of a single grain and single malt whiskey, as well as a single pot still Irish whiskey with its two distinctive components of malted and unmalted barley. They are blended to make whiskey, which contains its own unique palate, nose, and aroma. Then you have a single malt Irish whiskey. That gets its name from being made entirely from malted barley that is produced in one single distillery. There are must-dos for this one, including of aging the whiskey for at least 3 years in oak barrels and a bottling of 40% ABV or higher. And it's double distilled as opposed to the quintessential style of making Irish whiskey, which is triple distillation. Then you have your single grain Irish whiskeys that are made from a combination of cereal grains like whole grains or cereals, and that's distilled in a column still in a single distillery. There can be no more than 30% malted barley in that mixture. And of course, there's the single pot Irish whiskey, that's just created when malted and unmalted barley is triple distilled for a rich, unmistakable silkiness with distinctive pot spices. Pot spices being that kind of seasoned flavor that comes out of pot stills. Just like other whiskey offerings, single pot still has to be created with specified minimums, like a minimum of 30% malted and 30% unmalted barley. So that's the different types of whiskey.
Okay.
All right.
So I was actually going to ask if you wouldn't mind turning off your share screen because and
Sure.
keeping your notes up and then talking about the actual whiskeys you're going to try tonight or talk about.
Sure.
Then I can ask my questions.
Perfect. Not a problem. So my first whiskey of the evening. So I'm gonna be drinking some Writer's Tears. This is the Copper Pot. Um, I don't have much left. Maybe enough for just this event. So this is a blended Irish whiskey. It's blended of single pot still and single malt. It is aged in American oak casks. And then it is 40% or 80 proof. So 40% ABV or 80 proof. And this goes for about $50 or
Mhm.
so.
And what's the name of it?
This is Writer's Tears.
Oh, perfect for a librarian. Dawn says she loves writer's tears. Thanks, Dawn. I'm not a writer, so that doesn't hurt my feelings at all. Um, but like, you know how like when for a wine or there's a certain way to pour it, a beer, there's a certain way to pour it. Is
Mhm.
it same with scotch or for whiskey?
It can be. So if you're going to go super snob about it, the Scotch whiskeys have a very certain way of doing it. Generally, I like to use a Glencairn, just
Mhm.
like this, with a little bottom so you're not warming up your whiskey. So you just kind of hold it there. I usually swirl it around a little bit, get some air in there. I can already smell it kind of coming off.
Mhm.
And then you kind of stick your nose in, you get a couple of whiffs and kind of let it sit out for a second while you're, getting ready to drink it. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's more of a kind of let it get some air into it, especially if it's been stopped up in a bottle for a while. Um, you know, let it mingle a little bit, and then after you smell it a couple times and you get used to it, I mean, this one is, supposed to have apple and hints of vanilla on the nose, and you can definitely smell apple. It kind of smells like an apple orchard, which is really pleasant.
Mhm.
Hopefully, someone else out there is drinking some Writer's Tear as well, some Copper Pot.
It sounds like Dawn might be.
But it's really smooth. So it's a little spicy. Um, And usually you talk about it. So one of my favorite things about whiskey tastings in general is it's so subjective. Um, a lot of the times, I mean, they'll pay someone who knows how much money to sit here and pull out the flavor profile of a whiskey, and I'm not that person.
Mhm.
I can get the nose pretty spot on, I would say 90% of the time.
Mhm.
The taste, for me, it can change a lot. I have people disagree with me on this, but once you open a bottle after that first time, there's going to be changes in flavor. There's a little bit of air getting into that bottle. The light that might be in the room or anything like that can kind of change the flavors if it's sitting out for a while. I mean, I have a whiskey collection. I'm not sitting with writer's tears on my desk every night. So, it's been a little while since I've had this, but I can say like there's definitely like a spice there. The this nose of the apple is coming back through in the flavor as well. And it's really pleasant. It's a very smooth whiskey.
Mhm.
100% would suggest it.
Mhm.
One of the things that they mentioned for the finish is that it's long and elegant with dark chocolate. Super nice description. But I would say it is very long because I'm still tasting it, but I'm not sure about the dark chocolate.
Mhm. And this is on the lower end of the scale for price for you, but is it one that you recommend to people because of
Absolutely.
flavor?
Absolutely. This is a very approachable whiskey. This isn't something that's going to light your hair on fire or anything like that. Um, as far as an 80 proof or a 40%, that's pretty typical of a good Scotch or a good Irish whiskey. That's a nice base range. Yeah, you're gonna get a little bit of alcohol heat in there. That's unavoidable with any alcohol.
Mhm.
Uh, but it's not overwhelming your senses or anything like that. It's not like your tongue's on fire the entire time.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Neil asks, I've seen debate about adding water or ice. Where do you stand on this?
Mm.
And Tanya says, some people will find chocolate in anything. That would be me.
So water or ice. Now, that's fantastic. I believe that there are plenty of whiskeys that you should just drink neat.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm a fan of also having, whiskey on the rocks. I will say for some of my stronger whiskeys, I think I have a couple over here somewhere that are up in the 130, approaching 140 proof. Um, for those whiskeys, I actually like water. I prefer drops of water. Yeah, John, you also have that. Um, it just opens up the flavors a little bit more. It can be really astringent at that high of an alcohol content. So if you drop in a little bit of water, swirl it around, let it breathe for, a minute or so, it's a lot more approachable. You get more of the flavors out of it that makes it a little bit more, wanting to dive into.
Mhm. Somebody asks if you could tilt your screen down a bit so we can see the bottles and glasses that you're tasting.
Well, I can hold up stuff.
That sounds better.
I can hold stuff. It's
Writer's
just a
tears. Okay.
keyboard.
Yeah, I'll send out the list of what you've been
There.
drinking.
If anyone wants to take a screenshot, you're more than welcome to.
I love it. Okay. Let's see. Um, is there any benefit to bloom Irish whiskey by adding a dash of water? Is that what you just answered?
Yeah, yeah, I kind of touched on that. And again, it's a lot of preference. Irish whiskeys, if you're going up with stronger one, so I guess I'll cheat and show you what the next one is. Right. So the next one here is going to be our cast strength redbreast.
Hmm.
Right. So this one here, you're over that 100 proof marks, or you're at the 114 proof. So you're talking a little bit higher alcohol content from this writer's tears. I've tried it with the water. I have tried it without. I've tried it on ice. My preference is neat. It's not too hot for me where I'm like, ooh, that's going to give me some heartburn. So I think you can kind of go any way you feel with the lower proof stuff. You can add water if you like, but
Hmm. So, is that legal to have something that's over 100 proof?
yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Giving you ideas.
Well, it must be because you're
I
drinking
have some
it.
recommendations.
I guess I don't know what proof is then. What does that mean that something's proof?
Yeah, so that's basically the content of alcohol within it. So if you have something that's they go by percentages, proof is always double the percentage. It's how much alcohol is in that by volume.
Oh, okay. And Sabrina asks, you say neat. Can you explain that?
Sure. Neat is just a whiskey that is in a glass. That's it.
Mm.
You're not adding anything into it. There's no ice, there's no water, uh, no fancy straw or maybe an umbrella, nothing. You're just drinking the whiskey.
Just neat.
Just neat.
Ron says, my go-to whiskey is Yellow Spot, but I have enjoyed Redbreast 21, but cost limits my indulgence. Isn't this the one that you said was
Ooh.
like $80?
Oh no, the Redbreast 21, that one, that's a bit more than than $80. Also a fantastic choice. I'm a big fan of Redbreast 15. That's a fantastic one as well.
Hmm.
A lot of raisins, plums, and stuff like that. It's fantastic whiskey.
Okay.
So
Let's see. Somebody got kicked out. A lot of Scotch fans swear that one only single malts are the way to go. I really like JW Black as an easy drink Scotch, which is a blend. What do you think?
sure. So there are definitely differences between a good blend and your single malts. If you're going to go for the pure route, single malts all day. I'm going to liken it to kind of here in the States, right? We have blends and we have straight whiskeys. My preference has always been if you're going to have something like a small batch, right? You're going to enjoy a very small picture that that distiller has
Mm.
for that period of time that they were aging that barrel. Um, if you go with a single barrel, now you're cutting out all the other flavors. So single barrel is kind of like that single malt where you're just going to get that single tone, whereas a blend, like a small batch, you're going to get all of those nuances that every barrel in that group brings to the table. So I guess it kind of depends on what you're drinking.
Yeah. Yeah. John asks, many years ago, I received a bottle of Jameson 7 Crown whiskey. Do you know of any way to acquire it in the United States?
Seven Crown whiskey, huh? I've never heard of that.
Oh,
Jameson Seven Crown. Oh, I'll have to look into that. I know that I've looked at a website, Master of Malt. Uh, they offer, and this is for any kind of whiskey, but they do offer some pretty good prices, and they do have some fairly rare stuff. They do deliver to the United States, so that might be worth checking out.
hmm. And you already answered the question, is there a difference in taste between adding water versus having it on the rocks, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I believe so. Unless someone needs more clarification on both. That's it.
No, I think so. I think you covered it. I just want to make sure. And Arlene says, what is your favorite whiskey to drink and what is the best to use in cooking?
Oof, the my favorite whiskey to drink. That's impossible to answer. It really would depend on my mood. Honestly, sometimes if I'm just hanging out and I'm having, say, a cigar with my whiskey, I might go for something like the little book I have over here, or my Garrison Brothers Balmoria, something that's a little bit higher in ABV but has a really dark, rich flavor.
Mhm.
Um, if I'm, just having an evening whiskey, I might go something a little bit lighter, with Maker's Mark or, uh, you know, like my Russell's Reserves over here. I'm trying to like point in reverse camera, stuff like that. As far as cooking, do you mean in the food or while I'm cooking?
I believe I would say while you're cooking.
Uh,
Oh no,
well,
like in your cooking, in your food.
in my food,
Yeah.
honestly, I don't think I've ever put whiskey into my food. So I guess you'd have to. I mean, probably something more robust if you're making a dessert or something. I usually use beer in food because you can make stews and stuff with Guinness, but
Yep. Well, it was Arlene asked the question. She said she's cooking right now, so she
oh.
made her think of it. Um, Patty says, shout out to Yellow Spot, but Napog Castle is my favorite. So I'm going to ask you all, everybody that's in the chat or in the thing, put in the chat like what you like and what you have. Don't say what you don't like, but maybe things that you have liked.
Don't tell us what you don't like.
That's right.
It's a long
Um,
list.
so were you going to try the red breast?
I am right now. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm gonna pour me some because I know people may get curious.
Oh,
So
Maker's Mark have good recipes with their bourbon. Interesting. I have cooked with bourbon, Frank, so that's a good tip. And Dan is talking about Redbreast 12 year. And
red
Carmen
dress 12.
says she was given porridge with a few drops of whiskey in Scotland. I hope you were of
Oh.
age, Carmen.
What is the age to drink in Scotland? Is it 18?
I
Or
don't
is
know.
there no age? You just kind of go with it.
It's as soon as you can walk into a bar, I guess. I'm seeing chicken wings with Powers, Bushnells and Powers from Spirit Night in Marblehead the other night, Riders, Tears and Old Putney, Old School Jameson. Jameson, am I boring? No, you're not.
I have a
I,
bottle of Jameson. It's sitting right there. You're not
yeah,
boring at all.
not boring at all. Jameson Gold is always good. A lot of people Jameson. We went to a
Mhm.
Jameson distillery in Dublin. They sold a distillery batch. Any idea if I can get that in the States? It was very tasty Irish whiskey.
They sold a distillery batch. Probably not. My guess would be if it's something specialized for them, it would probably be limited distribution to just that country. It might even be just to around the Jameson distillery. There's a
Mhm.
lot of times here, in Kentucky, a distillery will put out something and it never leaves the state.
Oh,
So
wow.
I could imagine if it's a specialty release like that, they would just be for them.
Okay. Emil asks, for people with less familiarity with whiskey tasting, what would you suggest as a starter?
What was the question again? Sorry.
With people who are not as familiar with whiskey
Mhm.
tasting, what would you suggest as a starter? Like,
Oh, that's a good one. So my suggestion would be always start with your $20 to $30 range. That's going to get you one, it's not going to break your bank. Two, there's a plethora of ones in that range that are actually really solid drinks. So, and if you don't end up liking the whiskey, that's like something to sip on. You can make cocktails with them. So, one of my go-to cheap ones is Old Granddad. You can
mm,
either do the regular or the 114 if you're looking for a little higher proof. Evan Williams Bottled in Bond is a solid choice all the time. Cooper's Craft, they're all right. Um, yeah, I think those are probably three solid ones that you could probably go out the door with and start in drinking just general whiskey.
yeah. Yeah, and I'm seeing lots of recommendations in the chat. Some really Tullamore Dew, No Writer's
Mm,
Tears. Yeah, people are drinking as we're talking, so they're right with you, Travis.
perfect. Perfect.
Joe asks, and I think this is a really good question. Other than breed, what determines the wide range of pricing?
Age is generally the biggest indicator of cost. Now, that doesn't always hold true. I have actually seen some aged, like Evan Williams, which is kind of the cheaper version of another type of whiskey, but we're not talking about that. So I'm trying to stay away from that.
Mm,
But generally, it's going to be your age, the distillery itself. From a history standpoint, they might automatically increase it a couple bucks. But yeah, it's going to be age. The
mhm.
higher up you go, the more time it took, the less whiskey there is in that barrel because over time it evaporates out. So makes the price go up.
Mhm. Are the batches also a factor? Like if it's a small batch, does it become more rare, which affects the price?
So small batch in the whiskey world is actually usually referring to the selection of barrels in an aged area, and then all bottled in the same, like blended and bottled. So technically, being if a distillery is making a large quantity of anything, that won't necessarily impact the price. Its location can. Some distilleries, they're big on this is our infamous, rick house, and when we age it here, and it's only like 3% of whiskeys in the world get this area, and so they might make the price higher for that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. We only have a few more minutes left, but I did want to know what the third whiskey is that you're gonna try. And Joyce says that Old Granddad is great in eggnog. So
So, yeah, I think y'all were sitting there. You must have seen stuff because Yellow Spot it was the third whiskey, and I saw so many people talking about it. So,
Yeah.
Yellow Spot is a fantastic whiskey. Sorry, I was also drinking the Redbreast single cask. This one's about $80. I know I didn't really talk about it. This one's a single pot still. It's aged in oak casks. It's 114.4 proof. You can get it for roughly $80 here in the States. I won't go into the flavor profile since we're kind of limited on time. So I'll hop right over into our Yellow Spot. So this one's kind of climbing up the ropes a little bit, but it goes down in proof. So this is another single pot still whiskey. Up a little bit. This is actually aged in three different casks. So this is aged in a bourbon, a sherry, and a Malaga. This one is 92 proof or 46% alcohol. And this one goes for around 120. Sometimes you can get lucky and find it cheaper, but I've seen it on average around $120 here in the United States.
Oh, that's a higher one. Yep.
Yeah, this is the more expensive. This is one of those, if you start really loving whiskey and you start wanting to branch out, treat yourself.
Okay.
Definitely. Yeah.
If I wasn't working, I would have. Um, I have a couple of really good questions here that I want to get to before we end. About the bottles, Arlene asked, if the light can affect the taste, should they be bottled in dark bottles rather than clear glass ones?
Sometimes you want to see what you're drinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to see the colors of some of these whiskeys, some of the deeper kind of red colors. Some of them are a lot lighter. I mean, Yellow Spot you can see is, you know, there, but then see if there's enough. And then you can see this one's a little bit lighter on the
Mm-hmm.
writer's tears. So,
Yep.
but that's why you just kind of keep them out of the sunlight, keep them in a nice, cool, dry place.
Mm-hmm. Two people want to know what's the highest priced whiskey that you know of and if it's worth it.
That I know of, or that I own.
I would say I'm going to go with
Because
what you know of.
so the highest priced whiskey that I would ever suggest to somebody, ooh, that's a good one. Because usually you're just getting it's a kind of a scam if you get too high up, especially if you're paying those secondary market prices. Think Blanton's right off the top of my head. That it's a $60 bottle of whiskey at MSRP, and you are lucky to walk away with it at more than double the price, and it's not even worth $60. So that's personal preference, right? I have birthday bourbon right here. That aftermarket is 1400. I got it for MSRP. 100% worth the $240 for MSRP on that one. It tastes really good. It's a good conversation piece, and it's a rare whiskey, so I think it's fun to have. The Garrison Brothers Balmoria that I have sitting right here is also another really excellent choice at just over $200. That one's super, super rich flavors, good proof on it, and it's good for all around drinking.
hmm can you stay for a couple extra minutes?
Absolutely.
Okay. Karen asked, this is a little bit different, but any insights on Japanese whiskey? They're supposed to be good.
Yeah, so Japanese whiskeys are really good. They're also pretty unique. And I say that they're unique because there's a lot of Japanese whiskeys out there that are actually Scotch blends. So they'll buy the Scotch from Scotland, bring it over, blend it themselves. Sometimes they'll add an extra aging in there in the Mizunara cask, and then they'll throw it out there. They do actually make their own whiskeys in Japan. I found them to be very, very light in flavor, kind of light fruit flavors in them, very approachable to drink. The only thing that I don't like is that their prices have gone crazy. They used to be relatively approachable, and now they're almost out the door where it's hard to even consider buying one.
Mm-hmm. And then Joey asks, I loved brown sugar bourbon called BSB distilled by Heritage Distillery in Washington. Heritage sold the brand and recipe to another US distillery. The new distillery ruined the flavor. Is there any way Heritage could remake their fantastic beverage since their buyer changed it to whiskey? I love BSB, but can't find it anymore. How can I find out? What can be done to bring BSB back? It's such a great sipper. Neat.
Uh, Start a riot. No, don't actually do. That's part of the problem. There's been a few whiskeys out there that I've tried, and you're like, yeah, this is so good, and then you just find out that the reason why the bottle's still sitting on that restaurant shelf is you can't get it anymore, and they charge a premium to try it. So, unfortunately, you just kind of have to hope that they bring it back.
Hmm.
That's unfortunate part.
Well, from the history you shared with us, it's really come and gone, like distilleries and names
Hmm.
and things like that.
Absolutely.
Um, can whiskey go bad?
Um, Technically, no. There are, again, it depends on the environment in which you're keeping the whiskey. It's not like wine, right? So, there was a comparison with aging wine in oak barrels or wood barrels. Um, Wine, yes, because that continues to ferment and all that while it's in the barrel. Once whiskey is out of that barrel and bottled, that's it. I mean, if you left it in the barrel to continue aging, it would just get more and more concentrated until it evaporates out of the barrel. And
Hmm.
then you're left with the water behind, which I wouldn't drink.
Hmm.
That'd be kind of
Interesting.
gross.
Yeah. Well, and maybe that kind of answers the question about the light of the bottles too. It's like if it doesn't make that much of a difference. Like I think it does with beer.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with whiskey, it's a good to not leave anything out in the sun that you don't want to have broken down. I mean, the UV rays will slowly break down the flavors in whiskey,
Mhm.
but would it be something that you get sick drinking? No.
Okay. People are like sharing whiskey stories in the chat, which I think is hysterical. But Joyce said something really funny. I hate to admit this with my brother-in-law on this webinar too, but I have not tried Irish whiskey because I've always enjoyed single malt Scotch. I know you talked about a whiskey to try, but is there like we talked about there wasn't that much of a difference if you take out the malt? Is that what it is?
The peat,
The peat.
the peat, yeah. So yeah, and honestly, good. I mean, Scotch is great.
Mhm.
I enjoy Scotch myself. I have no qualms with it whatsoever. But I will say, if you want to, test out different distilleries and all that, why not?
Hmm.
The Redbreast is a great brand. The Redbreast 12 is a perfect place to start, especially if you're already used to Scotch and you're kind of used to stronger flavors. A
Mhm.
Redbreast 12 year.
Okay. Actually, that brings me to my last question. On a whiskey, what's the difference between something that says 8 years versus 12 years? Is there a general thought on why it's better?
It's so one thing to remember is when something is aged for 8 years, right? It's been sitting wherever it's been aging in that barrel for 8 years, untouched normally. And then you get an extra 4 years of aging out of it. So you might not visually see it. It might end up just being in the flavor. It might end up being a little bit darker, but age is flavor, right? So if you think about it, if you're looking at a whiskey on a shelf and you have one that's 3 years, you have one that's 6 years, you have one that's eight, and one that's 12, and they're all the same price of $100, I would probably bet my money that that 12 year is going to be miles ahead of that 3 year, and I'd spend my money there first,
Mhm.
especially just if it's just out of curiosity.
Mhm. All right. So somebody asked me, John, what's in that bottle she's sipping this? So I am on the clock, so it's just water. But as soon as this is over, I'm gonna go and see what we have in our cabinet. Um, Travis, this has been fabulous. Thank you so, so much. I feel like I've learned so much, and also I'm a little bit thirsty despite my water.
We'll go out there and celebrate St. Patrick's Day.
I will, and I really appreciate that you took time on your St. Patrick's Day to do this talk with us.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I appreciate that and also all of this knowledge. So if you guys are interested, follow Travis on his podcast and you'll learn a lot more. And maybe we'll invite him back someday, you know?
How about that?
That would be great. So have a great day and night. And everybody, Have a safe and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's.
Thank you.